in Gallup, New Mexico. It was a flying trip. They spent a long weekend down there. They repainted their highway sign, and that's another children's home that we support. And he kind of did a exploratory trip down there for us and asked some questions and so forth. The reason I mention that is he prepared about a 12 or 13-minute presentation that we have running on the screen in the fellowship hall. Not in the foyer, but if you go on out where the coffee pot is and look up, it's on that screen. And we'll probably have that out there for the next 10 days running. So if you go by there and you only have time to watch 5 minutes, then maybe the next time you can catch the rest of it. But the beginning of it is very interesting. There's some facts and figures in there about how many homes in that area don't have indoor plumbing, or how many of them don't have water, and things like that. So that's not the only facts and figures, but that's some that stuck in my mind. So anyway, then Steve also interviewed the director down there, Jim Christian, who's been down there, I'm guessing, at least 19 years, maybe longer. And so he's the director of the children's home and also the principal at the school. So he talked to him, and that's on that report and that video also. So I encourage you to watch that so you can get an idea of what some of our mission work is. So let's go to our Father in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your many blessings. We thank you for this week that so many of our number can be up at Camp Ivydale. We'd ask you, Father, to be with those that have spent considerable amount of time preparing for that, the staff, and we pray, Father, that you'll be with them, give them the energy that they need right now, and may they be an influence spiritually and otherwise on the young people that are up there. We'd ask you, Father, to be with the campers and everybody that attends up there, that this will be an uplifting week and that they will draw closer to you as they draw closer to one another as brothers and sisters. We'd ask you, Father, to be with all of our classes that are meeting this evening. Be with this class as we look at your church as it progresses through time, and that we can learn lessons from that. We pray all this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we were looking at the emperors, and we looked at these guys. We looked at Caligula, but I didn't really mention in Acts 9:31, where it talks about the church. That is during this period of Caligula, when it says, "So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria enjoyed peace, being built up and going on in the fear of the Lord, and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it continued to increase." And that's during the time of Caligula. Now, Caligula got into a row with the Jews, and he built these images that he put in all the synagogues. He had one built to put in the temple, but then he died before that could take place, and they removed that, and it never did go into the temple. But he never did persecute the Christians. Then the next emperor was Claudius, and we've already talked about him, so I'm not going to mention much more about him other than reading Acts 12, and this occurs the first 2.5 verses during his reign, when it says, "Now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also." Okay, so that took place during the reign of Claudius. And that's what we said there is he gave Judea to Herod Agrippa to rule, and the Jews turned against, and the Jews turned him against the Christians. And he had James, the son of Zebedee, killed. And we saw that in Acts 2. And then we had gotten to this chart, and then we went past it and started talking about Nero. And there's something important that I want to mention about Nero's persecution. But this chart, I know you can't see it very well, but this is the family tree of Herod the Great. And somebody asked the question in class, and it got me digging this week, but they asked, was Herod a Jew? And Richard and I both thought, well, I think he's a Hasmonean. So now you're all wondering, what is a Hasmonean? Right? I hope you're wondering that. I don't know. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. I'm trying to look at what this guy's name was, but this is the Hasmoneans. And again, I know you can't see that, but the Hasmoneans are the Maccabee family. And if you attended the Sunday morning class that Charles taught, he spoke a lot about the Maccabees in the period between the Testaments. And so the Maccabees, the first one up here is Matthias. And then a lot of these became high priests. Some later on, when they threw off the Seleucids, then they had their own rule for a time period. But trying to figure out where to go next with this. But the ancestor of Matthias was Hasmoneus, the Latin translation of his name. That's not the Hebrew translation, where the word Hasmonean comes from. So when you hear the word Hasmonean, that is a fancy word for the dynasty of the Maccabees. And I'm not going to go into the Hasmoneans more than that. But what I do want to point out here is you had Matthias, and then his sons, Eleazar never did rule or do anything. Jonathan was the high priest in, let's start over here. Simon was the high priest in 142 to 132 BC. Before that, it was Jonathan Maccabees was the high priest in 152. You got to remember, these are counting down. And before him, it was Judas Maccabees was the high priest from 165 to 162. And then John Hyrcanus actually ruled for about 30 years when they got rid of the Seleucids. Now, you're probably wondering, who are these Seleucid guys? Well, Charles also talked about this. Remember Alexander the Great? You know, and he went and conquered all this area, and then he died after he had conquered all this. And 4 of his generals took over. And one of those generals was Seleucus. And Seleucus took over the area above Palestine, including Palestine. Ptolemy, another general, took over Egypt, and I won't go into where the other two did, but they basically carved up Alexander's kingdom into 4 parts. Okay? And Palestine sat between where Seleucid and his kingdom was, and Ptolemy and his kingdom down in Egypt. And they kept fighting with each other and traipsing up and down Palestine. And so Palestine went back and forth between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, but it spent most of the time under the reign of the Seleucids. Okay? And so they finally I was hitting the wrong button there, sorry. They finally, under Hyrcanus, defeated the Seleucids when they got weak, and they formed their own kingdom. And he became the king. He was the high priest from 75 to 66 BC, and then again from 63 to 40, but he was also the king in 67 BC. And then following him was his brother Aristobulus. They were both sons of this guy, Alexander Janus, and then the family went on down. You come down here to Antigonus Matthias, and he ruled from 40 to 37 BC. And then we don't have Seleucids anymore, but the other thing we have now is the Republic of Rome. And when I say Republic of Rome, in 47 BC, there were no emperors yet in Rome. Rome's been, for centuries, has been a republic. And so they send an army here, and they conquer the Jews, and they subjugate them, and they leave them to be leaders, but they put somebody in as the king. And the person they put in as the king in 37 BC is Herod the Great. So when you ask the question, was Herod a Hasmonean? Technically, no. But he was married to a Hasmonean princess, Mariamne the first. She was his second wife. Herod had 10 wives. 6 of them he had children with. He had 14 children. But she was the one he loved the most. She was his second wife, not his first wife. Okay, so now then, let's talk just a little bit about this Herod guy. I know this isn't in the part of the emperors, but, was Herod a Jew? No. Was he a Hasmonean? No. Herod was an Edomite. I didn't know that till this week. But Herod the Great was an Edomite. He was born in 73 BC. His father's name was Antipater. It's spelled Antipater, but it's Antipater. That was his father. And he lived in southern Palestine. And he was an Edomite, so his son was an Edomite. As you probably remember, the Edomites were a Semitic people just like the Jews. Do you know where the Edomites came from? Esau. So you had Abraham, you had Isaac. Isaac had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob, name changed to Israel. He became the father of the 12 tribes. His brother was Esau. Esau was the one that the descendants of his were the Edomites. Okay? So they're both Semitic. In other words, they're not Hebrews, they're not Jews, but they're closely related to them. And his father, Antipater, converted to Judaism. So he worshiped the one God, the one true God. And he, worshiped in the temple just like everybody else, but he had to stay in that outer courtyard because he wasn't born as a Jew. And so Herod also was converted to Judaism. But that was in the 2nd century BC that Antipater converted to Judaism. So when the Romans were looking for somebody to put over the Jews, he was a natural one to choose. When Pompey invaded Palestine, Pompey was the Roman, anyway, when he invaded Palestine in 63 BC, Antipater supported his campaign and began a long association with Rome. 6 years later, Herod met Mark Antony. That Mark Antony, the one that his girlfriend was Cleopatra from Egypt. Okay, so he met Mark Antony. They became lifelong friends. Julius Caesar also favored the family of the Herods, or Antipater, and he appointed Antipater procurator of Judea in 47 BC, and then he in turn appointed his son Herod to be the governor of Galilee, and then 6 years later, Mark Antony made him tetrarch of Galilee. Okay, so that's how that happened. Then in 40 BC, the Parthians invaded Palestine. We haven't even talked about the Parthians yet. But to save his life, Herod went to Rome. And he actually had the Roman Senate. This guy was a smoozer. He was a born-to-be politician because Mark Antony liked him, Julius Caesar liked him. He goes to Rome. The whole Senate likes him. And the Senate appoints him as the king of Judea and gives him an army to come back and kick the Parthians out, which he does. And then he's the king of Judea for 32 years. Okay. I'm kind of giving you some information about Herod because this is stuff a lot of times we don't think about when we talk about this guy. All we think about is this Herod the Great was the guy that was the one that tried to kill all the babies in Bethlehem. And by that time later in his life, he had had a real mean bent to him. But early on, he was world famous as a builder and an architect. Richard and Lori and Vicki and I saw Caesarea Maritima, on the coast in Palestine, and he built that city and named it in honor of one of the Caesars. He built a palace in Masada. He built a palace in Jerusalem. He built a fortress in Jerusalem. He was a vast builder. He had this aqueduct that went from Caesarea Maritima, which was on the coast, but that's saltwater, all the way up to these springs. And I mean, this thing looks like a highway. And it's a big chunk of it for miles still stands today, 2,000 years later. So he was, quite the organizer and quite the builder and so forth. But he was unchallenged in Judah for 32 years. To solidify his power, he divorced his first wife, who was Doris, and married Meridian the first, this Hasmonean princess, because there was this conflict between the Hasmoneans, who he had just replaced, and himself. And he started his new, dynasty for the Herods because they supported the emperor. The emperor made his father a Roman citizen, so consequently he became a Roman citizen, and all of his children became Roman citizens. So all of these guys became Roman citizens, and yet they also were affiliated with the Jews. So that's why you see this conflict there when they're in Jerusalem, and the Pharisees hate them because they're not true Jews, and yet they're favorable to the Jewish religion because his father had been converted to Judaism. And yet the Romans liked him because he understood the Jews and could keep peace better than anybody else that they had tried putting in there. So that's the Herods. Meriamne was his second wife. Then you got Malthus the Samaritan. She had children, Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus. Then there was Meriamne the second, who was not a Hasmonean, but she was from Jerusalem. And then Cleopatra of Jerusalem, not of Egypt. He also had these other wives over here, and I won't pronounce all of their names because you'd never remember them anyway. But Herod Agrippa down here was the grandson of Meriamne. And the reason we don't have anything here is she had two sons, and Herod's sister turned him against the woman he loved. This was his true love, Meriamne, this Hasmonean. She was a beautiful woman. He loved her, just kind of like Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He loved this woman. But his sister turned him against her and made him think that she was conspiring against him. He ended up disposing of her two sons, her grandfather, her mother, maybe a couple of stray uncles in there. The whole family, of the Hasmoneans that were related to her, he killed. So that's why this is kind of blank. They never amounted to anything because he had them all killed. But before he killed these two sons, they had a son, King Herod Agrippa, and then he was married to Herodias. But Herodias was her third husband. She was first married to Herod Philip, and then when she left him and married Herod Antipas, her second husband, that's when John the Baptist came in the scene, and he rebuked them because her first husband hadn't died yet, and she remarried. Well, that was a big no-no, so he, called her all kinds of names. He got thrown in prison. She had her daughter Salome dance for the king, and she then asked him for his head, and they gave him John the Baptist's head. King Herod Agrippa was the one that was that we just read about in Acts 12. He executed James the son of Zebedee, one that we've been watching in The Chosen, and he imprisoned Peter. And then Herod Agrippa II was his and Herodias' son. He married Bernice. Bernice is part of the picture in that she was twice widowed, left her third husband to be with his brother Agrippa II right here. So they weren't very faithful to their husbands, these women. Okay. And then Drusilla, Do I have Drusilla up here? Yeah, there's Drusilla. She left her first husband and went and married Antoninus Felix, and we know him as Felix in Acts, and he's the one that put Paul in prison when Paul was arrested, and he left him there for 2 years. We always think of Paul as this, he went around and did all these missionary journeys and did all this stuff. Can you imagine what we would think today if we were sidetracked for 2 years and couldn't do God's work? If you were a minister or somebody trying to do God's work, and we would think, God's abandoned me. Had God abandoned Paul? No, but he spent 2 years in prison here in waiting to be, I said Paul, Peter, Peter. Spent 2 years in prison. Well, I'm getting mixed up. Herod Agrippa imprisoned Peter. Felix put Paul in prison for 2 years. So it was Paul, and it was Felix that put him in prison. Okay, that's enough of the Herods, I think. But I had to go back to the Maccabees to show you the connection that Herod was not a Hasmonean. He was not a Jew, but he had been his father had been converted to Judaism, and so he followed along also. He also completely rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. Part of the Western Wall that, you'll see the Western Wall on TV sometimes and so forth, this huge wall, that's still standing today from when Herod rebuilt the temple. It was on like 37 acres, this temple complex that he built. We went down there one evening, back in March, and we went to this Western Wall, and I felt a little uncomfortable because all these Jews were going there and performing their prayers, and they, were bouncing up and down, and it was not bouncing, but that was their way of concentrating. The way it was explained to me doing that. But we went right up to the wall and then went to the left, and you went inside, and then you could go down, and the ground level now is 50 feet higher than it was during Herod's time when he built the temple. And you could go down there, and you could see the main blocks that they built of this wall. And when I say blocks, we saw one that was 46 feet long. It was 14 feet tall, and they can't move it, and it's the base of this wall, and they estimate that it's 9 feet thick. They also estimate that it's 570 tons. I don't know how they moved it, but that's why Herod was so amazing as a builder. To put that into perspective, the Great Pyramid in Giza, the biggest pyramid in Egypt, the biggest stones there are in the burial chamber down in the center of that. The biggest ones of those are estimated to be 80 tons. This is 570 tons. The Romans were going to dismantle this wall and use these stones for something else. They hacked at this thing and chipped at it. They finally gave up. This thing was so big and so massive, they thought, we're just going to have to leave it here. And it's still there today. The Romans never moved it. But the whole wall sits, on stones like this. That's the biggest one that they know of, but the other ones are of a lesser degree, but they're still huge. Okay, so this is part of what Herod the Great built there. This Herod the Great, he also embellished other foreign cities like Beirut, Damascus, Antioch, Rhodes, and then that's the cities, then many towns beside that. The other thing Herod did that I didn't know, he patronized the Olympic Games, and for a period of time was the president of the Olympic Games. I always thought this guy just hung out in Palestine, but he made like 4 trips to Rome. He had, while he was in Palestine, he had Mark Antony come to visit him, and he had one of the Caesars come to visit him, which was pretty unheard of. But that's how well thought of he was in Rome. But the Pharisees still thought of him as a foreigner. At the end of his life, he altered his will 3 times and finally disinherited and killed his firstborn, Antipater. That's this guy right here. That's why he's not up here. And then he had his kingdom divided among his sons. And that's why you see later on in the life of Jesus and stuff, you have these different Herods that are, one's over, Idamedia, one's over Palestine and Judea, one's over some other place. So now that was all with, Augustus had to sanction that, but that's what he put in his will, and Augustus did sanction that. So Archelaus was the king over Judea and Samaria. Philip and Antipas shared the remainder, and they were tetrarchs. Okay, so that has nothing to do with our class on the persecution of the emperors. But I don't know where else I would squeeze this in a church history class, but I just found this interesting to know more about the Herods, to know more about their background. And okay. So now then, that brings us to Nero. We talked about this and the fire and him blaming the Christians. This is the part that I wanted to get to. And if you've tuned me out up to here, please tune back in and pay attention to this, because this is an important part of our church history class right here. Tradition has it, Nero reigned from 54 to 69 AD. Tradition has it that Peter was killed in Rome during this time. Tradition has that. And because of the quote where Jesus said, asked Peter a question, Peter answered him, and Jesus replied, "And upon this rock I will build my church." We think he's referring to Peter's answer. Other people think he's referring to Peter. And so there's a lot of people that would like to place Peter in Rome, because then they could say Peter was the first pope. In the New Testament, there is nothing to suggest that Peter ever went to Rome. There's nothing to suggest that he was ever an elder there. There's nothing to suggest that he had anything to do with Rome. Since his original mission was to the Jews, he probably had little reason to even go to Rome. Now then, so why would they get this idea that Peter was the first elder in Rome? The stories that tell of Peter's being martyred in Rome at this time are based on late tradition. Now let me put this into perspective for you. If you date all the books of the New Testament, the books that were written the latest, let me say it that way, were probably the epistles of John, the epistle of 2 Peter, and they're written about, the epistles of John are between 90 and 110 AD. The epistle of 2 Peter was about 110 AD. So they're written right at the very beginning of the 2nd century, the end of the 1st century. Okay? So remember that. Eusebius refers repeatedly to Peter's stay in Rome, and he relies upon the unhistorical book called the Acts of Peter as his chief source. Anybody heard of the Acts of Peter? They're an apocryphal book. There are actually 5 apocryphal books named for different men called the Acts of. There's the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Andrew, the Acts of John, the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Thomas. These are all apocryphal books. The Acts of Peter are written at the end of the 2nd century. So about 80 to 90 years after the last New Testament book was written. So when I say it's late evidence, that's what I mean by that. It's 4 generations later when this book was written. Now these 5 acts were all assembled into a I don't know what to call it, because they're each one a book, but they were assembled together, kind of like the New Testament, but by the Manichaeans. We'll get into Manichaeans later, but Manichaeans are people that followed after Mani, M-A-N-I. He was a Persian that proclaimed to be a Christian, but he was a Gnostic. In other words, he thought he had this special knowledge, and they used these books to give them different information. If you were to look up, and the only extant copy, the oldest extant copy we have of the Acts of Peter is in, I think it's in Latin, and it's from the 4th century. Okay, well, that's not a deal breaker by itself. The fact that they think it's actually written, in the end of the 2nd century is really the serious, the serious concern there. But when you go to reading about this Acts of Peter, this is where they find the fact that he requested to be crucified upside down. It's in the Acts of Peter. The bulk of the rest of this book is about, in fact, one copy, it was called The Acts of Peter and Simon Magus, Simon the magician, Simon the sorcerer. And the bulk of the book is about this contest that the two of them have, because according to this Acts of Peter, Peter thinks that this Simon is a deceiver and that he's using deception to convert people and for gain. Does that sound familiar to something in Acts maybe? Not the same Simon, but it sounds very familiar. Okay, and so it's also going to sound like Elijah and the prophets of Baal, because Peter in this Acts of Peter, now this is all apocryphal. This is just, not based upon fact, but he has a contest with Peter to see who can perform real miracles. Okay, and some of the miracles that they talk about is revivified salted fish. What I mean by revivified, they take salted fish. You know what salted fish is? Dried fish that's been, it'd be like trying to take a bag of jerky and turn it back into a cow. Revivified salted fish. They took salted fish and turned it back into a live fish. One of them could make a dog talk. Another one made a baby talk. I don't know if they're ventriloquists or what, but and then they got into this contest of a resurrection competition, of which Peter eventually won. Now, none of that is based upon fact. That's why I said this is a fictional work, okay? But I just wanted to tell you, kind of point out how far-fetched this work was, okay? But it was in this work that Eusebius keeps quoting from, and Eusebius was not a church father, but he was a father of church history, because he didn't, he wrote these accounts in about 325 AD. So he wasn't with the church fathers that we mentioned earlier, Clement and Tertullian and all those guys. He's later on, but he wrote the first church history book. Okay, so Eusebius wrote this, and he kept mentioning that Peter was in Rome. Peter was in Rome. All of his citations for Peter being in Rome come from this Acts of Peter that was written, 100 years after Peter died. And it's, has all these far-fetched stories in it. The other thing about this is that he also quotes that Justin and Irenaeus, who were church fathers, cited Peter as being in Rome at some point. Well, Justin and Irenaeus, guess who they were quoting? Eusebius quotes them, but guess who they were quoting? The Acts of Peter. So all three of those, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Justin, they were all quoting from the Acts of Peter to point out that Peter actually went to Rome. But there is no concrete evidence that Peter was ever in Rome, other than this book that was used by the Gnostics to support some of their claims for the special knowledge that they had. Now in 1 Peter 5:13, which is the last verse of 1 Peter, Peter sends greetings to the Christians in Babylon. And Eusebius says, Babylon here is referring to Rome. And a lot of us think that Babylon does refer to Rome. Guy N. Woods, who's a Church of Christ minister and a writer of commentaries, wrote on the commentary on the New Testament epistles of Peter, John, and Jude, page 135, and this was written in 1954, so the guy's not alive anymore, but some of you may remember Guy N. Woods. He was a famous preacher. And this is, quote, "While there is no evidence this was so, there is a good reason to believe that Peter was working among the large Jewish population of historical Babylon when the letter was written." So he thinks that when it refers to Babylon, it's really referring to Babylon, not to Rome. And of course, they would want it to refer to Rome if they were wanting to make the case that Peter was the first elder of Rome. But there's nothing in the New Testament that supports that. And there's nothing other than this Acts of Peter that was written late, in the 2nd century that supports that. And I guess I should just leave it there. There was one other thing that I wanted to say, and now I can't remember in my mind. It escapes me. But, Peter, because his mission was to the Jews, he probably had little reason to go to Rome. So now then, we're still under Nero. Tradition is that Paul was beheaded during this time as well. Now that tradition is supportable because the book of Acts tells us that Paul went to Rome, correct? And we think that Paul went to Rome more than once, and that first time he went to Rome, he appealed to Caesar when he was being, held, I don't have it up there anymore. When he was being held in prison and they sent him to Rome, they think he was finally heard, that he was released, as a Roman citizen, and they couldn't find anything for him to be guilty of. And then it's thought that he went to some other places after that. He visited the churches in Crete, in Asia Minor, and then it's thought that he went to Spain, and it's while he was in Spain that he was seized in about 67 or 68 AD, went back to Rome a second time, and while he was in Rome as a prisoner there, after writing 2 Timothy, that he was then beheaded in Rome. So the tradition is good that Paul, the book of Acts tells us Paul was in Rome, but the tradition is strong that he was killed in Rome. The tradition is very weak that Peter was killed in Rome. We know Paul was in prison twice there. And yet Paul received no special prominence for starting the Roman church. If in fact anyone deserves such attention, it should be him and not Peter. Now the other thing that I find interesting, if the church really wanted to support their case for Peter going to Rome, what book do you think they would have argued to put in the New Testament? The one book that supported the fact that he was in Rome and that, the Acts of Peter. And yet nobody in that current time could look at that book and even consider that it was inspired. It never had a single vote by anybody that it was an inspired work and that it should be included in the New Testament. None of the lists of the canon of the books in the New Testament ever included the book of the Acts of Peter. And yet, if they really wanted to make an argument, you would think they would have used the one case, the one written book that said that Peter was in Rome. And yet they knew that they couldn't use that. I didn't get past Nero. But we did get something important accomplished today, and I hope maybe I beat a dead horse. But it's important to understand that there is a strong case for Peter never being in Rome, and for Peter never being the first pope or the first elder in Rome. Yes? Oh, excuse me, you got a microphone.
Just a question. Even if Peter was in Rome, went to Rome, spent some time in Rome, doesn't mean he was the Pope.
Exactly. But it's kind of hard for anybody to argue that he was the Pope if he was never in Rome. But you're right. And you still have to build your case out of what Jesus said to Peter, in the Gospels. And that's, subject to interpretation. And we think it's weak interpretation that it refers to it referring to Peter. The other side, the Catholic Church, would say it's weak to say it's referring to Peter's statement. So it just depends on what side of the fence you're sitting. But anyway, I apologize that I didn't get much farther than that, but we still have 4 minutes. So let's see, we got Vespasian as the next emperor after Nero. I'll let you read that, but he was the one that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. Tradition states that this withdrawal, the Christians withdrew from the city and declined to resist with the Jews, and they survived. They were, Eusebius says there were very few, if any, Christians that died. And the reason was that they all believed that what Jesus said in Matthew 24 was a prophecy, and they were looking for that. Matthew 24, let me read that to you, verses 15 and 16. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation. Now, some people think that that's referring to the Roman army, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet. Now, that's part of what Larry taught, and he taught a lot about the desolation of abomination, or abomination of desolation. I'm flipping that around. But some people think that that's referring to the Roman army. And spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And so they saw the Roman army coming, and they said, this is the beginning of the end, and they all left. And so it was just the Jews that were left in the city when the Romans surrounded it and ultimately destroyed the city. So that was under Vespasian. Domitian was the next emperor. He reinstituted the violent persecution of the Christians. Now, Nero was very violent with the Christians, but his was local. It was contained mostly around Rome. Domitian, not so much. Christianity was still considered a sect of Judaism. Eusebius says he was the second to promote persecution against us. Domitian, this is a quote from the Ecclesiastical History of Eusebius, where Vespasian says, put to death without any reasonable trial no small number of men distinguished at Rome by family and career, and have punished without a cause myriads of other notable men by banishment and confiscation of their property. He finally showed himself the successor of Nero's campaign of hostility to God, end quote. That's Eusebius writing about Domitian. So you see, a lot of this persecution is going to take place of the Christians, not just because of what they believe, but because they're becoming successful citizens in the empire. And if you persecute them as being revolutionaries, you can take their property. I thought I had till 7:45. I have till 7:40. Sorry, I was trying to squeeze more in. I apologize. Okay, so we'll stop there.